So what I'm going to talk about today is this idea of reflective relational practice, which is about assessing and enhancing the quality of our relationships. In some ways, this is inspired a bit by this quote from Brenda Zimmerman, the late Canadian systems thinker and practitioner, who said, "The most important unit of analysis in a system is not the part, it's the relationship between the parts." So I want to kick off by saying a little bit about the genesis and the inspiration and the ambition of this work on reflective relational practice. So it is emerged basically from the last I've been freelancing for the last 2.5 years, and the main question, the kind of top level question that I've been exploring is, how can change be supported in complex and adaptive social systems? The diagram at the top right of the slide is taken from Glenda Ouyang's work on human systems dynamics, which is a picture of complex adaptive systems, starting at the bottom with actors and their interactions, which then leads to the emergence at the top of system-wide patterns, which then in turn influence future rounds of interactions. So that's the kind of understanding of complex adaptive systems that I'm working with. This work on reflective relational practice is also informed by my own personal, intentional and reflective efforts to nurture a community of friends in Brighton since my 2020 return from DC. The work has been inspired by lots of people and organisations, including the Collective Change Lab, the Human Learning Systems Community, the Relationships Project, the School of Systems Change, and of course USAID. In some ways, and many of you will be familiar with the diagram at the bottom right of the slide, taken from the 5 R's paper. In a way, my thinking about reflective relational practice is a footnote or some sort of an insert to the 5 R's paper. I should also mention that what I'm presenting today comes out of some initial collaboration with Alexandra Nastasia at Apt Global, which was funded by the FCDO. The ambition of this work is to support relational approaches to systems change. But for now, where I've got to is an initial note to inform exploratory conversations, which proposes a way to think about, assess, and enhance the quality of our relationships. So in the remainder of the presentation, I'm going to talk a bit about what is reflective relational practice, how might it be, why might it be useful, how might it be supported, how might it be put into practice, then point out some limitations of it, and then just close, and then just have some closing remarks. So firstly, what is reflective relational practice? So for me, reflective relational practice is about reflecting on relationships through relationships to improve the quality of those relationships. This is quite aligned with a recent piece of work that came from the School of Systems Change called Action Inquiry, a Learning Approach for Systems Change. So as my kind of fuller note says, this reflective relational practice is really not rocket science at all. It's at least as old as humanity itself, and it is developed across a diversity of contexts. So there are references in the paper to work by Lana Jelenjev, Melanie Goodchild, also work by Tyson Yuncker-Porter, and others, including lots of Indigenous practitioners and scholars from cultures where relationality has remained a much more important part of the social landscape than in Western Europe and North America, perhaps. So it's an approach which is designed to enable people and organisations to collaboratively assess, inform and enhance the ways in which they relate to one another in order to improve the systems and communities that they're part of and the patterns and outcomes that emerge. I think that, as with many other things in the landscape of complexity, it can be useful to think of reflective relational practice as an emergent learning journey. So a journey that moves through questions of what, so what, and now what. So what is about kind of observing relational patterns. So what is about trying to understand and make sense of those relational patterns. And now what is about working out what one might do on the basis of those observations and that sense making, what one might do to take action to improve the quality of the relationships that we're involved in. I think it's potentially quite a simple approach. It's easy to tailor. It's widely applicable, And this is very important. I think using it can really exercise and build individual and collective agency. So why might it be useful? I think, why might it be useful? I mean, basically, I think it might be useful because relationships are the connective tissue, or to use Sam Rye's language, the relational infrastructure, which makes social systems more than and qualitatively different from the sum of their parts. Relationships and the sense making and learning that takes place through relationships are really key to the workings of complex living and learning social systems. So why does the quality of relationships matter? So simply, healthy relationships foster collaborative learning that is embedded in a social and relational context. They enhance adaptive capacity and well-being. Unhealthy relationships lead to fragmentation and polarization, limit individual and collective agency, and reduce adaptive capacity and well-being. So reflective relational practice might be useful because it can help to change the outcomes that emerge. Well, because in order to change the outcomes that emerge from a social system, you need to enable changes in the relationships that shape its dynamics and capacity. I just point here to two pieces in the references. One, the piece on the relational work of systems change by Catherine Milligan and colleagues in SSIR, I think it was 2021, and then Cynthia Rayner's book on the systems work of social change, both of which I think are fantastic on this. So reflective relational practice supports intentional reflection about the qualities of the relationships that we are in, which can inform the actions we might take to enhance those relationships. So why might it be useful? Second slide on why might it be useful. Very quickly, very simply, because healthy relationships can enhance communication and resource flows amongst actors. They can build trust, strengthen cohesion, and foster a common sense of purpose. They can enable collaborative sense-making, learning, and social innovation, and they can strengthen the agency and capacity of actors in the system, individually and collectively. So now on to, in effect, the meat or the tofu of the presentation. So these are kind of two, a lens and then a tool, which I think might be helpful for supporting a process of reflective relational practice. So the first lens is a suggestion, a proposal, an idea that it might be helpful to think about different aspects or different dimensions of relationships. And that doing that, disaggregating relationships into the different aspects or dimensions of them, all of which are clearly interconnected, might be a helpful way forward. So then the question was, okay, so what dimensions might it make sense to focus on? Here, my kind of criteria were twofold. It was kind of dimensions that matter for emergence in a social system is one, and two, dimensions that might potentially that be improved through a process of reflective relational practice. And the choice of dimensions was very much informed by the idea that a system's effectiveness, particularly a complex system's effectiveness, depends on finding an appropriate balance, a dynamic balance between autonomy and interdependence for its constitutive parts. So the diagram shows four key aspects or dimensions of relationships that shape the dynamics of social systems and the nature of emergence in those systems. So top left is positionality and power, how actors establish, communicate, and understand their respective positions, priorities, power, and influence. So this is represented by the relative position, the size and shape of those different objects, those different shapes. Then top right, connections and flows. How actors are connected, including through the ways in which they access, exchange, and use information and resources. So on the diagram, this is represented by the different colors of the arrows, the thickness of the arrows, and the directionality of the arrows. Bottom left, boundaries and conflict. So how actors define, maintain, and negotiate their respective positions, interests, and boundaries, managing points of tension and difference. Here, this is represented by the kind of different strengths of the boundaries of the different actors, and by hearts and thunderbolts on the things that connect them. Bottom right, actors and emergence. This is about to what extent actors, or maybe a subset of actors, the green ones on the diagram, see themselves as being part of an emergent collaborative system that is more than the sum of its parts. I did have yesterday a graphic designer on LinkedIn contact me out of the blue and offer to improve my diagrams. So I was both grateful and slightly marginally insulted, but I will definitely be chatting to that person over the coming days. So let me just illustrate what that might look like through a hypothetical but common international development partnership. So positionality and power. So a donor organisation and a local NGO initially struggled to collaborate because the donors' priorities were driving the agenda, heaven forbid, creating an imbalance. After reflection, they instituted regular priority setting sessions where both parties articulated their interests transparently, leading to more balanced programme design. Then on to connections and flows. So information was primarily flowing one way, from the field to headquarters, with little sharing of strategic thinking from headquarters back to the field. By creating shared digital spaces and regular cross-team exchanges, they established more multi-directional flows of knowledge. Boundaries and conflict. When disagreements arose about implementation approaches, both organisations initially avoided discussion for fear of damaging the relationship. Through facilitated dialogues, they developed protocols for constructive disagreements that acknowledge different perspectives whilst maintaining respect. Fourth, for actors in emergence. Over time, both organisations began to see themselves less as individual entities with separate goals and more as part of an emergent system or team addressing complex social challenges together. This enabled them to be more adaptive, jointly responding to emerging needs, rather than rigidly following predetermined plans. So you might want to think about how you could apply this framework to a system of social relationships, or even just one relationship for starters, that you are part of. So here, I decided to focus on my relationship with Rachel Leeds, with her kind permission. So Rachel, I've never met Rachel. We've only been in touch since about September, October, just prior to the publication of the local systems position paper. So it's been a short time frame. We live on different continents. We've never met. But thinking about the dimensions, our communication, our connection has been very solid on each of the first three dimensions, with appreciation and respect in terms of positionality and power, two-way respect, clearly. Secondly, clear, open and generous communication for connections and flows. Thirdly, great conversations about differences of perspective for the boundaries and conflict dimension. And then for the fourth one, actors in an emergence, really, for me at least, feeling part of the same team, feeling part of a team that is trying to keep the flame of local systems alive, is trying to nurture the community of local systems practitioners, and is trying to continue informing policy and practice with a local systems flavour. And the result of that is that I am increasingly keen to do what I can to support the team and the community and to work with Rachel to do that. And as an indicator of the quality of relationship, this morning I felt comfortable enough to ask Rachel whether it was okay to use her as an example in this presentation. And she graciously said that that was okay. The second aspect, so the first one was like a lens to think about relationships and the dimensions of relationships. The second element, which I guess is a bit more of a tool, is the idea that it might be useful to develop in a participatory way a rubric for sense making. This is very much inspired by the work of Julian King and others on the call, including Florencia Gwezovic. So a rubric for sense making to support gathering and analysing data and evidence about the nature and quality of relationships along the four dimensions. So, I mean, hopefully this is fairly self-explanatory. The rows are the four dimensions and the columns are the kind of state of play with the quality of the relationship in each of those four dimensions. So from unhealthy to stale to healthy. And then the content in the cells describes different levels of performance for each of those dimensions, for each of those kind of columns of quality of relationships. So if you look, for instance, at the boundaries and conflicts row, you can see the contrast between what makes for an unhealthy boundary and conflict dimension and what makes for a healthy boundary and conflict dimension. So this is a framework for guiding the process of gathering and then analysing data and evidence. A couple of things to note on this is this is not for comparing things against some sort of notion of best practice. Instead, this is about shining a light of intentional awareness and reflection on patterns of relational practice in and across different contexts to inform actions that might be taken in those contexts. It's absolutely to be designed and put into practice in a participatory manner. I want to move on to say a little bit about how reflective relational practice might be put into practice. I'll speed up a bit now, I think. So again, I think it's helpful to think of it as a journey of collaborative and emergent learning with the dimensions and the rubric as a lens and a tool to support that journey. So in a way, the journey runs through the what, which is gathering data and evidence, observing patterns, identifying similarities, differences, and connections. The so what is about developing an understanding of the landscape and the causal dynamics and the implications of the patterns of relationships, and then proposing hypotheses about patterns and how they emerge and change. And the now what is about selecting entry points for engagement and learning and taking action for impact and learning, perhaps through systemic portfolios. Then moving on, I wanted to be clear about this because it's come up in some feedback I've had, including a very helpful exchange I had with Marcus Janel recently on this. This is what I'm talking about here. It's simply an idea. It's a proposal. It's a suggestion. It may or may not be useful. I am not kind of aggressively looking for situations or partners who I can somehow persuade or incentivize to put this approach into practice. It's a suggestion, a contribution to a conversation. And in the kind of early explorations about its potential application, it would involve going through these sorts of questions. And at any point in this flow of questions, a potential partner, a potential organization which might be interested in using it might say yes or no, or kind of maybe sort of to these questions, which would result in tailoring it in different ways. The last point on here about moving from what to so what to now what has made clear to me that looking at relationships and learning is insufficient on its own. So here we are. Yes, and. So yes, and power, incentives, and behavior. So yes, relationships are an important aspect of the dynamics of complex social systems, but reflective relational practice will not, on its own, quite clearly erase the structural features which shape behaviours and relationships. It won't address the conflicting worldviews, extractive resource flows, power imbalances, vested interests, and often misaligned incentives that shape behaviours, relationships and systems. Also, it won't provide you with much guidance about now what, because in order to come up with a decent answer to now what, you need to have some sense of the constellation of causal dynamics that shape the emergence and the evolution of the system. And reflective relational practice on its own does not give you that. So I think there's a need, value to combine something like reflective relational practice with a political economy analysis that focuses on how actors' behaviours and relationships are shaped by and in turn shape the landscape of power and incentives. Not coincidentally, because I think my thinking came from a blend of things I was working on. I was working at the same time with Kathy Bain, who I think is on the call, on some work with SOAS ACE on the SOAS Anti-Corruption Evidence Research Consortium about navigating the political economy of corruption. So I think there's potential, quite a lot of value with combining a focus on relationships and learning with a focus on power, incentives, and the behavior of actors in the system, which might, and this is said kind of tongue-in-cheek, lead to a focus on, and this is what I'm planning to focus on, is kind of pattern spotting and the political economy of positive deviance, healthy relationships, and pockets of effectiveness for social systems change. Or in a slightly snappier way, patterns power people and pockets. That's pretty much it. I just wanted to end with these two diagrams. One is from the SOAS ACE report, which the diagram kind of shows the which Kathy did a fantastic job of teasing out from our colleagues at SOAS. Most of this was in their heads, but Kathy and colleagues did a great job of teasing out this kind of mapping of system and the relationships in order to identify promising entry points for engagement. And the second diagram is taken from Dan Honig's excellent work on relational state capacity, showing the ways in which relational state capacity is generated through interactions and then becomes a stock or a resource for future interactions. And